My name is Malachi. I'm a reporter at Bridge Detroit. I cover the city council mostly, but cover a lot of local government issues. And I've had the distinct pleasure of following, probably 4 or 5 community benefits process from start to finish. I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel here. I'm very glad that we've got some great experts here to talk about community benefits and community land trusts. Starting to my left here is Janine Hatcher, who has 35 years of business experience across a variety of sectors, including real estate, marketing, legal, staffing agency, automotive repair, and nonprofit sectors. She's one of several founders of Genesis Hope, a leading community economic and health development organization working to address root causes of social risk factors in health. She has served as the executive director of Genesis Hope. Drum roll. Since it was founded in 2008. The nonprofit community development and economic development organization promotes healthy lifestyles and wellness. It connects families to resources and creates healthy, resilient communities for residents in Island View, the villages of Detroit, and adjacent neighborhoods. Next here we have Andy Newman. He's an associate professor of anthropology. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped you, Aaron. My bad. Aaron Goodman right here is an urban planner with 20 years of experience in community development, environmental advocacy, and resident engagement. Since 2019, he served as the City of Detroit's Planning and Development Department as the manager of Detroit's Community Benefits Ordinance process. In this role, Aaron brings together the community and developers while guiding some of the most significant development projects through that engagement, benefits negotiation, and approval process. Previously, he was working at the community engagement. He was the community engagement director for Community Development Advocates of Michigan, or of Detroit, which you might know as CDAD, and also served as a Peace Corps volunteer in West African communities. Aaron has received several honors recognizing his leadership, including a Spirit of Detroit Award, and he completed the Detroit Revitalization Fellowship. Aaron also received a bachelor's degree in social sciences and a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Michigan. Aaron's a lifelong Michigander and proud Detroit resident. In his spare time, well, folks want to know, you can be found volunteering at your block club and exploring our wonderful parks, listening to great music. I love that. So, Andy now is the associate professor of anthropology at Wayne State University. Mr. Newman's work has been focused on the politics of urban development and collaborative strategies for urban research. He is co-editor of a People's Atlas of Detroit, which I found in a couple of coffee shops around town. It's definitely out there, and is published extensively on urban social movements, environmental politics, and food systems. He serves as associate editor for the journal City and Society. And then last but not least is Sam Boyd Scardfield. Sam is currently supporting Detroit's neighborhood leaders and organizations through the creation and activation of structures and spaces within community hubs, urban farms, neighborhood corridors, public schools, and liberated territories. Sam has recently founded Open Works LLC, which is an emerging design build practice that incorporates community scale production and place-based education to design and build public infrastructures while growing and nurturing human capabilities. He's also the project and program director of Freedom Dreams Eco Village and Makerspace. He's on the advisory council of the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center and a Detroit Equity Alliance Lab Fellow. So please give a round of applause to our panel here. All right, some of these questions are going to be for individual panelists, but I'd like to start just asking everyone here for their perspective on the community benefits agreements that we've seen come to fruition through the city's ordinance. The CBO, as Bryce mentioned, has been in place for about a decade plus now with some changes. So how successful do we consider this process overall? Are there particular projects that have set a good example for how the CBA can deliver equitable development and investments for residents? And maybe are there ones that you can think of that noticeably fell short? And we'll just kind of work down the panel here if you'd like to start. Do we have these?
Oh, I forgot we have these. Are these working?
They are. These are for the room, and then, yep,
I got
the
you.
others for the Zoom. Yep.
Alrighty. Well, mine is not green.
You can have mine.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Janine Hatcher, and I serve at Genesis Hope, and we're located in Island View and the villages of Detroit, Michigan on the east side. And I guess the one that I know the most about was with Stellantis. And I would have to say that it somewhat fell short in terms of benefits that it provides to the community. I think the process went well. I think residents did have an opportunity to, voice their opinions about things. But in the implementation, I would have to say it somewhat fell short in the benefits that it can provide. And I would have to say the number one thing was folks were complaining about, the climate issues and, coming from the plant that they really did not address. And still to this day have not addressed it. There's also what residents refer to as light pollution, right? They have really, really bright lights that are on all the time, and it disturbs residents and their rest at night. And I guess I would say the positive thing was they did offer home repairs, but I think the distance from the plant itself and what they identify as the community they would serve really, really fell short, because immediately around the plant is mostly vacant, right? The residents are just a tad, further to the west and to the east. So I think it could have provided a lot more benefits to the community than what it did.
Thank you. Excuse me, should I go next?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So again, Aaron Goodman, City of Detroit Planning Department, and I facilitate the community benefits process. And just want to say, first of all, it's really an honor to be here, particularly here in this space in the 20th year of the U of M Detroit Center. That place, I have a lot of, obviously I went to the University of Michigan, but I have a lot of personal, professional experience in this place, really from the beginning. My office when I was at CDAD was across the hall. So I've been coming here for a long time, so just really glad to be here, and glad to be here with Janine and my fellow panelists. It's really an honor. I just want to take a step back on the community benefits ordinance for a second before we start talking about particular projects and their successes and their failures. But I think we should really be proud as a city. We are the first city, still really not the only city, but the only major cities across the country that actually has a community benefits ordinance. It was passed back in 2016. It was amended in 2021 by City Council, some changes, but we continue to be unique across the country with the process that brings a level of transparency and community engagement to major development projects. So I really see it as, the theme is Workshop for Democracy. This is a form of direct democracy where you are bringing developers and community members into direct dialogue and talking about the issues related to that project and how it can benefit the community. And so I think it's really, and we're talking about multi-million, multi-billion-dollar developments, huge projects. Bryce in his video mentioned some of them, some of the most significant developments. And we're regularly contacted by other cities, jurisdictions across the country about, how do we do this? How do we really facilitate that dialogue? And what are some of the impacts and outcomes that come out? And one thing that's unique is that process, establishes a neighborhood advisory council. Those are regular Detroiters, neighbors, who come and sit at the negotiating table with developers, and hear from the community as well and get all the input and such. So I just want to make sure people understand, that this is a unique process. It's maybe, it's an innovative process. I have 1 minute left to answer this question. Okay, I have a lot to say about this, obviously. But so just on successes, one thing, as a planning department, our goal, let me talk about the process. Our goal is to create a consistent process from project to project, and one that is also transparent and fair. And I think it's important because developers and community need to know what to expect when they're entering into this, because it's an intense process. It can feel high pressure at times. You're talking about very large investments. You're talking about very significant impacts. And I think the main difference that, so we try to kind of set that ground level, but at the same time, how an individual neighborhood advisory councils, and these are made up of 9 individuals, and the developers, how they show up in that space can really make all the difference on how the process goes. If folks are coming with a spirit of, trying to solve problems, that's great. Or if it's the spirit of trying to, fight, that can also kind of cause issues. I'll just say in response to, what Janine kind of brought up, yes, Stellantis probably stands out as one that has been probably known to maybe be disappointing or not meeting expectations coming out of the agreement. A lot of that does have to do with the air quality issues, and I think it's important to note that air quality was really, it's something that's regulated by the state. This is a city process dealing with city regulations, and so we're kind of stuck in a little bit of a catch-22 where we're relying on the state of Michigan to enforce their laws as far as what's required for air quality, and it's not really something the city can regulate or necessarily add additional regulations on via the community benefits process. So I just want to kind of highlight that. But I will say that the community benefits ordinance process did allow for a lot more, I guess, community engagement on that issue and really raise that issue and make sure, and because folks would come to us at the city, be like, what can you do? It's like, well, we turn and put the pressure on the state of Michigan and be like, you really need to get on this, even though it's not part of the, technically the community benefits agreement. So I know I've spoken too much already, so I am going to pass the mic there.
Thanks, Aaron. My name's Andy Newman. I'm from Wayne State University. I'm an anthropologist who does research in cities, and I've done work in kind of collaborative research in Detroit, but also cities elsewhere in the world. I think I definitely agree with the idea that the ordinance and the passing of the ordinance was a really important moment for the city and an important moment for residents. At the same time, if you go back into history, the passing of the ordinance was hobbled a little bit by a debate over what kind of ordinance should be passed, if you recall. And one of the big issues with the passing of the ordinance was the question of enforceability. And the version that was passed did have less mechanisms for enforceability than the original version that was put forward by residents who initially started the organization. So I think it's an imperfect tool, but definitely a tool that we're lucky to have in Detroit and that provides a lot of opportunities. The two big concerns I have, just from the perspective of, I'm looking at it more from a macro perspective of looking at different places, there's best practices. These are, although we are unique in terms of our size, there are a lot of cities that do have this system, smaller cities usually. And there have been national discussions about best practices and so on. And one of the things that I think is important to think about is the process by which residents become a part of a neighborhood advisory committee, who that is, how they get involved, and then the work of the neighborhood advisory committee itself can sometimes have issues. I've heard people tell me stories about getting 800-page documents with 1 week to review them and stuff like that. And so there's issues of capacity, and maybe that's even a place where academic institutions and stuff can partner with residents in this process. And so that's like a kind of one challenge they face. I think, there are others, but I also don't want to downplay the positive impact of having this in the first place. But like many city kind of initiatives, and especially an initiative that comes about as the result of a popular mobilization, it's going to have to be a work through time. And I think the important thing is that energy stays behind this initiative to keep it evolving, for sure.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me right? I'm kind of a soft talker. All right, I'll be a little bit more direct. My name is Sam Boyds-Garterfield. I am primarily with Freedom Dreams Community Land Trust. I'm a student of Detroit. I've been here for the last 5 years, building relationships over 8 years, invited in to kind of facilitate and work with a lot of community organizations, like the Bog Center. And so I'll say this, I'm also the seedling on the panel here. I'm the youngest with the least experience. And so this perspective kind of comes from what I've seen and what I've experienced in our neighborhood. I think, kind of building off of what Andy was saying, I think the community benefit agreements are more of a reactionary position. They're kind of after the development has already been decided to be in the neighborhood. I think that kind of stands to the larger narrative of Detroit itself, and I think that's why it's always kind of an uphill battle with these. I think also, I believe there was a citizen district councils before we went into emergency management that was quickly removed because residents were getting in the way of the emergency management. Houses were demolished for a period of 2 years without regulation. And in 2016, when, meaning that their houses were buried in the foundations with the asbestos and the lead, all the materials. A lot of the work that we're doing right now as we're building new structures is uncovering the old trash, the foundations, and our kids are having to pickaxe through the cement foundations and things like that too. So it goes to a larger narrative of reactionary. I hope that the CBA or the benefits agreement shouldn't be put after the development has already been decided, kind of like with Stellantis. In our neighborhood is where the Detroit incinerator is, and that was taken down. That's been fought for the day it was implemented. It's in the 80s, the Coleman administration. And so I think, and when that was torn down, the neighborhood is kind of fighting over, well, what is the kind of social reparation that we can get from this because of the air pollution that was put in there? And so I think a CBA right now is kind of can be a way to address generational harm. But I think it's just one of the many solutions that need to happen. And I would like to see more proactive steps, taken as opposed to reactive.
My mic is not working, so I'm going to be loud, and hopefully you all can hear me. My next question is for Aaron. I'd like you to talk a little bit about the legal definition, the city's definition, in our ordinance of what a community benefit actually is. I think it's important for people to realize that, the CBO process is not about really whether a project should happen or should not happen. It's about extracting, I guess maybe that's a loaded term, more investment into the community, in exchange for the public investment of tax breaks mostly. And I've often witnessed, among the neighborhood advisory council that's put together of average residents, there's usually some confusion about what should qualify as a community benefit, what counts. And I think there's differences in interpretation that happen during those conversations that contribute to some of the challenges we see in people feeling like they've gotten enough out of those agreements. So Aaron, can you talk about, what is a community benefit? How do we actually define that in the ordinance and through the process?
Sure, yeah, thank you. So really we start with what it actually outlines in the ordinance, and because that is what we follow, and that's what we implement as a department. And so what the ordinance talks about is addressing negative impacts of the project. And that's what the Neighborhood Advisory Council is charged with, actually coming up with that list of impacts that says, this building's going to be here. How's it going to impact us in terms of construction? How's it going to impact us in terms of environmental concerns or infrastructure or housing? So that's kind of really the starting point. And people can interpret that different ways. Some folks might look at this, well, you're building housing. What about affordable housing? Is this going to cause displacement, and how can we mitigate that? Or you're going to have a 5-year construction period. You're going to be closing a bunch of roads. How are you going to make sure that you're communicating with us to go above and beyond, what's just in city regulations? I think one kind of thing that, maybe gets talked about a lot is like what's already required by city law, state law, and what's above and beyond. And I think the point of the process is to go above and beyond what's required by city and state law. I think there's an assumption that all these projects should be following city and state law. So impacts, negative impacts, how do you mitigate them is really what the community benefits process is about. And PDD, per the ordinance, we do kind of provide a list already of suggested impacts that the Neighborhood Advisory Council should consider and look at. It's not, prescriptive. It's not saying you must address these or these are the only things you can address. But that is something that we do to kind of set a level level set. That's the word I'm looking for. So that's important, and we also hold, kind of an extensive training to Andrew's point about, capacity and support for the Neighborhood Advisory Council. Something we do is we do hold a pretty extensive workshop and training, and really try to provide support to the Neighborhood Advisory Council through a process that is kind of intense and kind of quick, if we're being perfectly honest. One thing, Malachi, that you said was about, what counts and how do we know that we got enough and stuff. And there is kind of a focus, this wasn't always the case, on like dollar amounts, and kind of like keeping score in a way. That's not really the way I tend to look at it, because I think there's a lot of things developers can do through effort, through intentional effort, that may not have something you can easily quantify in terms of dollar amounts, or it doesn't necessarily mean they're writing a check. Sometimes the easiest thing for a developer is to write a check and make that problem kind of like go away, and it's a lot harder for them to be really intentional about making an inclusive development. And so if we just focus on dollar amounts, you may be missing other opportunities. So I think I'll leave it at that. One other thing I'll just want to say about enforceability, since it was brought up. This ordinance, something people should understand is that the agreements are between the city and the developer. The Neighborhood Advisory Council, just as the name says, is advisory. They advise. Very important. They have a very important role, and their advisement is taken extremely seriously. But what's important about that is that means the city is a party to the agreement. That means we can enforce it. I think in community benefits agreements across the country, where it's an agreement between the community and the developer, enforcement is a little trickier. It becomes a question of who has standing, who has capacity to take a developer, take legal action against the developer that's falling short. We do have an enforcement process, so these projects are absolutely enforceable. The agreement is a contract that is between the city and the developer. One last thing I know I was told to wrap up. I think there's also a little bit of a misconception about what projects kind of qualify under the ordinance. There's a lot, because I think the incinerator was brought up. This process, and for better or for worse, focuses on private developments that receive very specific tax abatements from the city of Detroit. And there's other types of forms of abatements and incentives that don't qualify and don't trigger the CBO. So sometimes I think there's a little bit of frustration in the community. It's like, why didn't this project go through this process while this process? It's how the law is written, and I think that's something that people should be aware of.
Great. This is a question for Janine, and Andy and Sam, if you'd like to join in on this as well, but I'd like to start with you about, do you feel, in reflecting on some of the frustrations that you voiced, that the CBO process itself provides residents with the autonomy to mitigate these negative impacts of development and achieve additional investments based on what the community wants? Or have we seen it kind of offload some of the responsibility of the city council and other parts of government onto essentially unpaid volunteers that are having to get caught up to speed on this? I think the process itself is potentially very powerful, but I've heard from city council themselves a little bit of frustration that in the past, deals have had to be kind of reopened at the table in city council before being authorized, because they have had to add things, and there's been kind of a frustration that a lot of that work is being kind of put onto residents, where maybe there should be more government involvement there. So do you feel that this has been successful in giving residents more autonomy to engage in that democratic process?
I would have to agree with Aaron. I'm glad we have it rather than not have it, first off. And yes, it is the first time that residents have, well, not the first time, but in terms of a development, that residents actually have a voice and a say in terms of what they feel the impacts would be. Usually there's someone else, thinking and making decisions on their behalf. So it's definitely a positive that residents get a chance to actually voice how they feel about it. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely. In terms of city council's role, I would have to say these councils are put together and there's city seats. Maybe, HRD should consider that when they're thinking about what city seats, who should sit in those seats if city council is having some type of challenge with wrapping their arms around the process, or maybe there's better communication that's necessary, so that all parties that normally are involved in economic development stay a part of the process. Adding the residents to the process should not be that disruptive, in my opinion.
Andrew, would you like to add to that?
No, I agree, and I'd only just add a couple of things, is that it's a common process that when you create a structure for people to be more involved in decision-making, that it then creates a structure where people get essentially pulled into a huge amount of labor when, again, like I mentioned, those capacity issues, there might be questions about it. And so I think in many ways it's a difficult thing to address because it's kind of a core part of it's like a paradox of the problem. If you engaging more means you get more, there's more strain on community, and it ends up being, like you were saying, almost unpaid labor, and often it's the same people doing all different types. You can see the same people always doing the same type of work. It really comes down to the labor issue of this type of work, and maybe that's something to think about between neighborhood advisory committees and council, city council, in terms of who gets involved at what stage of the process. For me, the stage of the process is a really significant part because as it's been framed so far, the idea that projects that come under this level of neighborhood advisory council scrutiny, if you will, are treated as a foregone conclusion. And the neighborhood advisory council is just sort of there to find particular benefits. So, that wasn't actually the original intention of the mobilization for community benefits. And so the question of what point a development project receives scrutiny, I think, is really important, and who does that work, I think, is really key. So I'll just say that before I move on.
Yeah, I guess I have more questions than kind of answers. I think as city development kind of moves out into more residential areas, we've been focusing, the last administration has been focusing on redeveloping downtown, and so it's a different type of resident lives outside of downtown, a different type of neighborhood is outside of downtown. And as we see, one of the constraints is $75 million development, that's, or $1 million of land transfer are these kind of triggers for, a call for residents to be able to have a say on the impact. I think is really is interesting to see how that's going to play out in the neighborhoods. I'd also say that it's not the only way. And you're right, the incinerator wasn't a neighborhood benefit agreement. It's environmental. They were flagged for environmental pollution, and that triggered a board of residents to come together and negotiate how do we repair the harm from the demolition and the air pollution of the incinerator. And what that has caused is kind of us residents to really try to figure out, well, what is the impact of that, and to negotiate. It's not with the city, it's actually with the company itself that's taking over the land, which is really interesting. So I think as we see development south of Kercheval, lots of money going in there, Grand River is going off, a lot of developments happening there from a lot of people that are are opportunists, taking the opportunity of big land grab and kind of experimenting with building. It'd be interesting to see, can that threshold be lowered? Can these neighborhood advisory councils be more involved? And can we imagine these councils actually creating some sort of plan or agreed values or system for what's happening in these neighborhoods as smaller development comes in? Because that's where a lot of the change happens. It's not just a big $75 million development. It's these small pockets, 10 parcels at a time, houses that are being, houses that are being built for ROIs. And so that's where I'd like to see some of these CVAs maybe start to be translated or evolved to smaller development projects.
Janina wanted to add a few things, and then we'll give Aaron the last word on this.
I just wanted to add that the community benefits agreement work began at the community level, right? The city didn't just up and say, oh, we want to offer community benefits agreements. And so from the community's perspective, speaking to the point of thresholds, we fought really hard to have those thresholds lowered. And I don't think that the tool that we have today is not the be-all, end-all, nor should we end our work in making the tool better. And you are absolutely right. As these developments are moving more into communities, that threshold is ridiculous. And it really does need to be lower. And I will add that across the country, neighborhoods have been successful in negotiating agreements without the city being involved. And I think residents need to continue that effort. And I will end there, but we're trying that in our neighborhood today. And I'll talk about it when I talk about the CLT.
Thank you. Going back to kind of like the original question and kind of, resident engagement and, is this too much work for residents versus should this be city council's job? I just wanted to say, the impetus for the ordinance really came out of frustration, I think, from the job that city government was doing on some very particular high-level projects. If people remember maybe the Marathon expansion in Southwest Detroit or even Little Caesars Arena originally, people did not feel like that the city government, either at the legislative level or the administrative level was doing a good job of actually, holding these projects to account and actually making sure that they benefit the community. So, and that's why we have the ordinance, and that's why, there was a desire really to have this more direct democracy. In other cases, I'd say for better or for worse, the CBO does kind of provide a template and a regulatory framework for when these are supposed to be engaged on, because in other cases, as was mentioned, residents have to organize and really organize and build power to bring developers to the table on a case-by-case basis every single time. And that's a lot, and it's not always going to work. I think the Gordie Howe Bridge is a great example. That was decades of organizing in order for that to become a community benefits agreement. That wasn't required by the ordinance. That was predated the ordinance. Even if it was happening today, that wouldn't even qualify under the ordinance. So I think that's important to recognize as well. I think that to the question about thresholds and what projects kind of qualify, we do have two tiers of CBO projects. Tier 1 gets all the kind of attention. Those are the big projects. There is a Tier 2. It's much more administrative in working with these smaller projects that are between $3 million and $74,999,000. There is a process there as far as ensuring that Detroiters are being employed in these projects, and that they are also meeting our design standards in terms of mitigating impacts and encouraging things that we care about, such as density and walkability in a neighborhood. I know that doesn't sound very satisfactory to folks, but it is there, and in some cases, those type of agreements do get more formally codified. But I do think there's a lot of work that could be done, because I think that there could be, what do I want to say? If you go project by project and everything is a negotiation, it provides for a lot of uncertainty project to project. And I think that there are lots of places, lots of cities that have actually embedded community benefits policies into their standards. So it's not really a question for the community or for the developer. This is the standard on XYZ kind of thing. So I think that's something to consider as well, because it is a very labor-intensive thing to enter into every single project and to have a new open negotiation and just kind of have to hammer everything out. It's we kind of know some things, we know things that work, and we should have a more standardized process for doing that on projects, because I think it will reduce time and effort and actually make it a little easier. The last thing I'll say, as I have to wrap it up, is some of the frustration I think comes from there's a lot of good things that come out of these, but I think people tend to focus on what didn't get kind of negotiated, what didn't get won. But I think people should remember it is a negotiation. So everybody doesn't get everything that they want. The developer doesn't get everything they want. The community, doesn't get everything they want either. Nobody's like dictating terms, and so I think that's something, that's a frame to think about as well.
I want to leave some time for audience questions, so we're going to move on and start talking about community land trust. But I guess just my last word on this is it's messy work, as Aaron notes. Nobody's fully happy at the end of these processes. And I've not really heard any real push for abandoning the CBO. I think what we've heard a lot of is let's strengthen the process, let's do more, let's give people more power to negotiate in these conversations. As far as community land trust models, and Janine, I want you to talk a little bit about this because I believe Genesis Hope is working on this right now. Talk about how that actually starts. If a nonprofit's interested in creating a CLT, what are some considerations that you have before committing to that path? And then once the decision is made, where do you kind of go from there to engage the community and get kind of buy-in and begin creating this organization that will hold the land in a trust?
I can only speak to the process that we've taken, and I think it's a good one. And first and foremost, it's organizing, as well as education. Community land trusts are new here in Detroit, although they've been around since the early civil rights movement. But they're new here, so residents aren't really used to the idea that they can control and own land forever, and that they are the stewards of that land. And so it's a lot of education and letting residents know that their small voice is powerful. And when you put those small voices together, you can make change happen. And so it's once you have the C in community, right, by organizing community, the next thing is the land. And currently, our Detroit Land Bank, should be more of a partner with not only community land trusts, but community development organizations as well. They refer to us, or we can sign up to be community partners, but it really doesn't feel like much of a partnership. It took us 7 years to finally get to the point of acquiring 10 lots. And our challenge primarily in our neighborhood is because we are a strategic neighborhood. And so, there's investments that, and a vision, if you will, for the neighborhood. And it happened through the strategic neighborhood planning process. It's just unfortunately going through that process, north of Verner, which is where we have over 300 acres of vacant land, really didn't have a strategy or a plan, right? So the first thing we did was, after organizing community and having community work on a neighborhood plan that could also hold not only the land trust accountable to what the residents want, but really empowering the residents, because that development is going to start to move north of Verner, and really already has, if you will. And so it's acquiring the land is the second challenge. The third is trust. Now, to me, that word means multiple things. Trust is how you can hold the land, right? It's a way of holding land. But more importantly, it's the trust that has to be built between residents. Quite honestly, it's not like the days when I grew up, where everybody really knew their neighbors. Neighbors don't always know each other today. And sometimes it's like 10 houses between you and your next neighbor. 10 vacant lots between you and your next neighbor. So this time of planning what you need to happen in the neighborhood, this time of coming together around education, really getting to know your neighbors, is how that trust gets built, because the community at large has to trust that those who are elected officials of the land trust are going to do the right thing, are going to do what's good for the community. And last, I will say, as we begin to talk to our public officials, we really need to especially if housing is your objective, which it is our objective, right? We're trying to ward off gentrification. And construction costs what it costs. So there has to be other mechanisms, and the community land trust is one way. Because if you give me subsidy once to build a particular house, that subsidy is there for the next family and the next family and the next family for up to 99 years, and after that it is renewable. And so it is a tool to make housing affordable, and we really need to start talking about permanent affordable housing. We want permanent affordable housing instead of always saying community land trust, because people may or may not know really what that means. And what it means is we're fighting for permanent affordable housing. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Andrew a little bit about outcomes and maybe what you've seen as a researcher in your perspective on, what kinds of benefits have we seen from some of the early CLT work in the city? I think, in the north end, the Detroit Cultivator Community Land Trust was one of the first and has been, I think, built up to a level now that we've begun to see some impacts. But, for me, it seems like the main goal there is to hold on to land and then lease it for community-directed uses, whether it be affordable housing. There might be other things on top of that. But what have we really seen benefit communities that have adopted this?
Well, as it was mentioned, these are newer in Detroit. There's not a huge amount of research on Detroit specifically, especially when compared to the nation as a whole. But I think there's fundamental issues you can look at that I think apply to both. And a lot of it, I think, builds exactly on some of what you were saying, that it's important. It's easy to fall into thinking of CLTs as a legal mechanism and an administrative process that people set up to fight off or stave off displacement that can be caused by development and make sure people have affordable housing. But it's really important, I'd say, especially because we're still in an early phase. And so pardon me for shifting the question, but rather than talking about the outcomes, which I still think we need to see, the process to get there, anyway, it's easy to think of it as an administrative process, and people who are involved in it probably get tied into thinking of it at that level. But it really is, to your point, a mobilization and community organizing process to build a sense of trust, and actually it's about governance and transparency, and it's a different type of governance that you don't usually see because it's within the community, and it breaks down the monolithic of the category of the community to make you think about who's different in the community, who has this position. So it's about community being accountable for community. I think that's really critical for it. In terms of one thing I'd really be interested to find out about Detroit that we know a little bit about for the rest of the country is there was an article in Urban Affairs, the journal, that pointed out that the financial health of CLTs looks really good, especially compared to other not-for-profits. And that's a really positive thing about their sustainability. So I think there's a lot, given how widely they're being adopted and how they're starting to become established and institutional players in lots of cities, it all points to a really positive, a net positive for this. It's a really hopeful thing. It's becoming a little bit less fringy and a little bit more part of the established mainstream policy discussion now. And that's really interesting to see. And I think it bodes really well, but it is just one tool in the toolbox, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I am. So Freedom Dreams Eco Village is a community land trust that's founded by a pastor, a coach, and a teacher that have all born and raised in the neighborhood, grew up in the neighborhood, and have come together over many years of discussion about what's possible in the land and what can we imagine to really bring back community values. We're in a neighborhood where, like Janine and you were talking about, there is one house or two houses per block. It's very rural. We have a pack of coyotes and buck that roam through our neighborhood quite often, and we're in 5-minute bike ride down the road. It's our land trust was really strategic. We were very heads down. We everybody has a different nonprofit. It's a coalition of organizations that come together. Each organization bought 9 parcels. So within 4 years, we had 40 parcels of land, all contiguous. So about 4 acres of land. And we used the method of purchasing not as a means of relationship building with the community. So the plans that we've submitted to the land bank were very simple, garden beds, a few trees. But when we did that, we gathered residents and neighbors and youth to build the garden beds and to then plant the trees and then to tend to the gardens. And out of that, we've built kind of a culture of doing and building and growing and nurturing culture. I run the makerspace there, so out of an old garage, there's a wood shop, and it's outfitted with materials that we've collected from pallets from the waste of the casino building. A lot of that came in and fueled about 80% of the structures that we have on land. And there's 5 different pavilions that were hand raised, hand cut by our youth, prefabricating trusses. And as we've been going, we've been gaining interest in our residents who in that neighborhood who are a little jaded, right? They're very engaged, but they're a little jaded about being a part of something, have actually come out and started to participate. And it's been really, really a slow process. And we don't have a master plan. We don't believe in a master plan for what's going to happen on the 4 acres. And we don't know if it's going to grow from there. But I think what the process is very organic. And there's a sense of urgency now because there is such a loud conversations about CLTs and partnering with the city. What are your bylaws? What are your ground leases? How are you going to do your 90? And it's like, okay, well, we'll get there. But right now, we're healing ourselves and trying to build relationships and get to know you across the parcel, across the 10 blocks, and talk about, did you see that coyote last week? That was wild, And oh, by the way, our pizza oven's open this weekend. We're having a big block party. Why don't you come out? And I think through that process, we're actually kind of building off the CBA conversation about being proactive. We're trying to also partner with the other organizations in this neighborhood that are organized and create a larger plan for the entire tract of land from McDougal Hunt, Pole Town, 94 down to the river, because there's a lot of engagement in that area. There's a lot of influence in that area with the Eastern Market. There's the Greenway that's coming in that area. Eastern Market held a meeting at our church, erasing our church building, and we have since healed that relationship, and we're on good terms with them. But I think it's about building relationships, and had we had a relationship, there wouldn't have been that awkward introduction. And so I see the land trust as not something that we're going to get to, but it's something that starts now. And it starts with getting to know each other and create a plan.
I'm going to put Aaron on the spot a little bit in an attempt to kind of weave together the 2 parts of this discussion. The Future of Health project, which is the new Henry Ford, emergency room and research center in partnership with MSU, and the Pistons, which is building some housing close to their performance center. Through that community benefits process, the Neighborhood Advisory Council advocated and secured a commitment to, I think it was $200,000 or so in funding from the developers to kickstart a CLT process in some of the surrounding neighborhoods there. So Aaron, can you give us some perspective on where that's at kind of right now, or what folks should kind of take away from how this CBO process can lead to a CLT, and then there's implications kind of beyond one particular project now where people have the ability to have this more kind of local control over what happens with development. And it was specifically in an attempt to prevent, to address some of the concerns about housing displacement that would come potentially as a result of that project.
Sure, no, thank you. And I'm glad you brought it up, because if not, I was going to bring it up. So I think it's a good example, first I'll just step back, that sometimes the discussions in the CBO process that come out of community benefits agreement are a really great space for thinking outside the box and setting precedent around certain policies or even testing certain things. And as Malachi mentioned, a big focus on the Future of Health project of Henry Ford Hospital, Michigan State, and Detroit Pistons was on housing and displacement. and the Neighborhood Advisory Council did advocate for support for starting a community land trust. And actually, it was more significant than even what Malachi mentioned. So initially, $250,000 to help with the startup of a CLT, another $500,000 once the organization is established, and seed money. Also, I believe, if I get this wrong, I'm sorry, I think it's about 10 parcels of land that Henry Ford was going to contribute to this effort to help start it. And so I haven't been super close to the implementation of that, but it's been very active. I know that West Grand Boulevard Collaborative has partnered with Develop Detroit to really take the lead on forming and getting organized around a community land trust, and all in preparation for receiving the second amount of funding and the land eventually to help kind of establish that. So I think it's a really great example of where the community benefits ordinance, community really leveraging that opportunity to do something different, to do something innovative, and really set an example. And I know CLT work was already happening in the city. I've been very familiar with it. I don't get to work on it now, but back when I worked at CDAD, the city was doing kind of like a study and report on it. We got to participate in that, and so it's something I've always found to be a very interesting, coming from community development, a very important community development strategy in terms of ensuring long-term affordability.
Janine had a spark of inspiration while we were talking, so I'm going to come back to her.
Yeah, so, I'm sorry, Sam? Sam touched on some of the, early in the video clip when he first started, he talked about, a nonprofit, a CLT is a nonprofit entity. And Sam touched on some of the key tools that the land trust uses. And right now, we formed an advisory committee so that while we're educating the community at large, this advisory committee also, raised their hand and said, okay, we'll also serve on the initial slate to become board members. So they got a more intense training so that they could draft the bylaws, right? How is our land trust going to be governed? How are we going to govern ourselves, if you will? But there's also key things that this board has to look at. You need the ground lease, and the ground lease is, how the land trust will maintain ownership of the land, and they lease it for whatever is going to get built on top. If you're talking about just purely vacant land. But then there's the restriction formula, right? What is that formula going to look like to preserve the affordability for the next family? And our residents had the advisory board really had to grapple with that, right? Especially in a neighborhood where the housing prices is going up. And there's been myths about CLT stops the family from, getting equity, and that's just not true. It's how you're going to share the equity, right? And that's the decision that has to be made. And for me, sharing is what's fundamental in all of the community ownership models. As mentioned, CLT is just one tool in the toolbox when we start talking about community ownership. But the fundamental principle is sharing. And then once we learn how to share, it's not as hard or as difficult as we try to make it out to be. We just have to go back to the principles that we all learned in kindergarten, how to share well with others.
I'm glad you brought this up. I wanted to talk about some of the implications for wealth building for home buyers, or maybe home leasers is the better term, for people who acquire or want to live in a CLT. And obviously, as I'm struggling to talk about this, something I'm a little more ignorant on. So I'm curious if you and Sam can talk about, for folks that want to buy property, that want to live in property that's in a CLT, what have been, what are the implications for wealth generation, which we always talk about in the city is buying a house is the first way that people really can build generational wealth.
They're still buying a house. The only difference is when they get ready to sell the house, they've made an agreement that they would share the equity, right? That's the only difference. They are leasing the land, right? But because of the mission driven of a CLT, it's a very small fee. It's less than what you would pay in a homeowners association fee, right? this leasing of the land. So you still own your home. You can make improvements. The advisory board has come up with a formula for how do you get, repaid for the improvements that you've made, So you may have agreed to, I'm going to use easy numbers. Let's say it sells for $100,000, we agreed to 50-50 split, but you've put, significant improvements in the home. Well, now you get more than the 50% out of the equity because of the improvements you made in it. It's still all about sharing that equity, whatever it may be, in that home in a fair way. So there's no real difference.
Sam, did you have something to add? And then we'll go to Aaron.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Janine. I think on top of that too, the benefit of the CLT is kind of controlled property taxes, and right now, city of Detroit's one of the most overtaxed cities in the country, and so I think that also helps build that longer term wealth in the families, so they're not having challenge. There's no threat of foreclosure, and so that there is a house that can be kept, within the family or that can provide productive equity growth for them. And I think also there's kind of like a bond of people that are buy into the land trust, that you the other equity you get is relationships and kind of the promise that you're going to be taken care of, that your house is going to be maintained, and then it's not going to you're not going to be left alone, if things are in trouble. So I think equity, and I appreciate you kind of cracking that open. Equity isn't just money. It's got to be holistic, and I think the CLT again is one of many tools that can help us do that.
I'll just add one more thing, and this isn't my area of expertise, but I think that to that question, one of the main goals is also providing homeownership opportunity for people who may not be able to afford it otherwise. And so if the question is, well, I'm not going to, I think like if you have enough money to go buy a house and you're concerned about equity, then maybe the CLT isn't for you. But obviously there's other goals too in community and having that trust together. But I also think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is providing a homeownership opportunity for someone who would probably otherwise be renting.
Yeah.
Really quickly, also looking back from this level of the individual and the choices they're making for a whole community, it's also ensuring that homes don't get, that the wealth of homes don't get extracted out of communities like we've seen in the past, right? Like in the financial crisis. So at a bigger level, it's about I think it's important to not just think about it as the individual choices, but the impact for the broader community to keep people and then their children in houses, generation after generation. So.
And then Andrew, I know before you said it's difficult for us really to have a sense of outcomes, but I was curious, like in terms of displacement prevention, are there examples in other cities that have used CLT? Any kind of insights that we have there?
The short answer is yes, but it is, like I said before, one tool. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't reverse the overall economics of the city. It doesn't change a development pattern that has actually may be stacked against residents. So establishing them is really important, and it's excellent that they were a part of that community benefits process, right? It's really important. They don't necessarily, just like so many other things, all I'll say is they're just not a silver bullet that changes everything, but they're a really important way for people to be empowered by having control of the most basic commodity in the city, which is land, right? So.
If you haven't yet, please write down a question. This is going to be my last question for the panel, and then we're going to open it up for all of you. Definitely want to hear more from the audience about what you think of all of this. Saved the land bank for last. It's a fun topic here in the city. Big news, the city council in its last budget actually discussed some ways to work with the land bank on developing more land trusts, and they set aside some funding for CLTs. So we're gonna have to see how that moves forward. But as you noted, it is difficult for nonprofit groups to acquire this land in large part because a lot of the vacant land in the city is owned by the land bank. So, in land banks, maybe helping to develop more land trusts and acquire land for free or at a discount for different uses, how important is that potential partnership? How would you like to see that partnership move forward? How can the land bank basically be an effective partner in creating more CLTs in the city? And we'll just move down the line here if everyone has insight on that.
Well, I think the land bank needs to not only become more of a partner with the community, but I would even say more of a partner with HRD, right? And really trying to understand how development happens, how much parcels you need, so on and so forth. So, for example, I will speak on cultivators, who was mentioned. They're in the north end and they have land, but it's not just the land bank. It's philanthropy. It's the lenders. It's the whole ecosystem that has to become partners with the community. In the case of cultivators, they've got the land. Now they're trying to do their first development, and they could only get money for two. Well, to do two units, and like in our case, we only got 10. But when we're looking at there's 5 lots on one side of a street and 5 on the other side of the street, and yet in the rest of the blocks on both sides are vacant. Well, when you begin to do development, the infrastructure is on the developer. So this block has been vacant forever. Can you only imagine the infrastructure work? The alleys, you can't even see the alley anymore. So we have to take on the cost of doing the infrastructure for that whole block, but you only gave me 5 lots, right? If I could spread that cost over let me get all the block and try to do a house on the whole thing, it might make sense there. The second thing that was mentioned was about taxes, right? There is a Michigan CLT coalition that is fighting for better tax situation for CLTs. If we're capping what the house could be sold at, right, we have to be able to cap those taxes too, or it's not going to make sense in the long haul. And so we've brought in national, Grounded Solutions is the National Association for CLTs. They are here working with us. I know that they've been working with West Grand Boulevard Collective, helping them get off the ground, but we've brought them on, just like the Michigan CLT Coalition has brought them on to bring research from other cities and states. And for example, Minnesota, CLTs are written into the state laws, if you will. And so they've been defined, they have a set aside. So CLTs are working wonderful in other places where you have state, city, and community all working together. Again, because these other states have recognized that they need permanent affordable housing as a part of their housing strategy. And we're still pushing our state and our local government to get there. We're excited that we have the CLT ordinance. We're still, kind of going back and forth. It's not an ordinance yet. It's still in draft. We're happy that we've got the CLT fund. It was a result of the CBA over there at Henry Ford, and people start yelling, well, they're getting money. We're trying to do a CLT. We want money too. So now there's about $3 million in the CLT fund, and still need to work on the rules around that. And I think through all of this effort, the land bank is getting wiser, right? I think they are starting to listen, but for the longest, they thought we were competing. When we said CLT steward land forever, the land bank holds land temporarily. They're fundamentally different, but for the longest, the land bank thought we were competition, that we were trying to do their job, and we're not.
Oh, that was great. I don't know if I have a lot more to add, just kind of like a outside perspective a little bit, because I'm not closely tied in this work, and I don't really, I don't know about all the nuances of how the land bank or all these other policies are going on, but I do think something Janine spoke to really highlighted for me that there's an evolving policy landscape that needs to continue to evolve, continue to be supported in terms of like city laws. It sounds like those are being developed, state law. I think when you talk about infrastructure, I would really suggest having serious conversations with the Brownfield Redevelopment Authority, because they often provide reimbursement for helping with infrastructure, and I think like that's a conversation that if it isn't happening, maybe should be happening, because I think it's a bigger perspective. Like there are tax abatements and tax increment financing tools available for development. I don't see any reason why those, if they're not already, they probably are available for CLTs, and if not, then we need to figure out how to make that so.
That's some of the research that we're doing, like with the pilot and
Yeah.
different things.
I also am not an expert on the land bank and its inner workings per se. So all I can really say is kind of report the things that I hear other people talking about through dealings with them. And in some ways, I'm going to echo what you mentioned, Janine, which is that, and for this also goes beyond the land bank, and it's just about community and community-sponsored entities, so to speak, attempting to acquire land. There's just for a long time been a lot of frustration when you look at large developers and how quickly they cobble together parcels for huge projects, and it seems like community groups struggle over 2, 3, 4, 5 parcels. And so I don't know if that's just most present at the land bank or if it extends beyond. But I think it's a really important thing, especially if a city wants to be pro-development. Think about all the different agents and entities that are developing the city in different ways. So that's all I'll throw in.
Yeah, building off what everyone has said, I've worked a lot with purchasing land from the land bank, and a lot of lessons have been learned. And I think their process is really interesting. Like when we were purchasing our first set of land, we had 6 garden beds on there, and they sent a bee seed inspector to come out and take a look. And he's like, I do buildings that looks like a garden bed. All right. It's also the timeline. It's a lot easier. So they give us 12 months to build garden beds, but if we were to propose some sort of housing development, they give us 6 months to do that, and or they can revoke the quick claim deed and move on to the next developer. And so when the city has put bundles of lots. There's a couple in our neighborhood that are, they say, hey, we want housing development here. They won't sell it to us because we haven't built a house, right? But we've been talking to the city, we've been talking to our district manager and our city council person for the last 5 years, and nothing's happened to it. The house that is there that needs to get demoed is just falling apart and becoming a hazard. And so it's curious. Questions around their capacity to really kind of make decisions on why is it that communities struggle over 2 to 3 parcels. But what we've seen on the east side is massive land grabs. And now we have a bunch of sugar maple tree stands floating around there that are very curious. But we can't get 2 parcels, right? And so it's the challenge is kind of a, what's it called, a cognitive dissonance. It doesn't make sense. And so it sours the relationship that could be with the land bank. It sours the relationship with the elected officials at the city council. And there's like kind of there's also a method of kind of a new form of blockbusting too, where a lot of these people who will have 400 plus parcels and will have 1 parcel in the middle of a block, another parcel over there. And so if a community is trying to move through that space, there's one in particular that has been docked for not paying taxes, yet he owns 2 parcels in the middle of our garden. Right? And we can't, there's nothing that we can do other than try to go to him, because that's his land, right? He's just a business guy. And so, what's the accountability for the type of community-led development that can get prioritized over speculator that is just perpetuating vacancy and abandonment?
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're going to take some audience questions. I think Bryce is going to lead us. I just want to say briefly, thank you to the panel. This was great. I learned a lot. You all added a lot of great insight and took the conversation beyond places that I thought the questions would take us. So I appreciate that. Oh, I'm going to take some questions.
So we'll alternate. I'll get the people that are here in the room who braved the winter
Okay,
temperature.
I got some virtual ones here.
All right, I saw your hand first, then I'm gonna get you, and then Malachi. After those two, you can hit the ones that were on the Zoom.
Right on.
Gotcha.
Oh, you can I squeeze two questions together?
Sure.
Yeah, all right, I wrote them down. So first, I talked to a politician recently who made me think about how a community benefit agreement could inform the fight against data centers. Choosing to move slow and intentionally, like Sam mentioned, in healing communities first, and instead of trying to jump ahead of China, who spent decades building the infrastructure to do this, do you think it's possible? The second thing is a little more pointed. Mike Duggan's prioritizing of market-based incentives has left us at a disadvantage in centering the needs and well-being of residents. Now billionaires like Dan Gilbert are using arts and culture to shield his developments and launder his reputation. How do we reclaim control before the whole east side gets gentrified?
Let's take those piece by piece, because I think the data center question is pretty interesting on its own. I don't know if that was anybody in particular wants to jump on that.
I'll try. I guess if a project, whether it's a data center or something else, met the qualifications of the ordinance, then they would be subject to the ordinance, and that would be a very interesting conversation, I think, given everything that's going on. But to this point, I'm not aware of any data center proposals. I guess I'm somewhat thankful for that on a personal level, but you never know.
Yeah, so I've been kind of hearing rumors, but also paying attention to what the administration is doing right now and deregulating energy demands for data centers and incorporating their social media company has merged with a fusion energy company. Right. So the administration is saying, hey, we're going to push these data centers because we have to, right, like you're saying. And it leaves us very vulnerable because there's so much opportunity, right, as a lot of these developers will see as the kind of a tabula rasa, blank slate of land to build these big centers. I think there is a data center that is coming to downtown Detroit. Is this?
I believe, so there's a tracker that lists two. I think one is more kind of in Corktown, and then there's one downtown, but they're not by this. The scale of data centers can vary quite a bit. So my understanding is there are some, but they're not kind of what we're seeing like out in Saline and these massive data centers. A data center is essentially just a place where servers are stored, but when they get gargantuan, that's when some of the environmental and other impacts come into play.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, because I don't want to speculate any further.
I don't really know either.
I think what also might be interesting of that is, maybe they become more decentralized. They start to get sprinkled out. And so what can the city really do? I know there's a lot of tech push in the city. We've got the new lab that's down there. All these businesses and software companies are coming in. And so it's, what do we want to prioritize is what happens, what do we want to let lead the evolution of our neighborhood? And I think, again, let's not be reactionary about it. How do we get at the forefront? So it's not a community benefit agreement after the development started. It's, hey, what do we want to have retrofitted in this building, or what do we want to have new build, especially on the east side, yeah.
I just want to add back to the beginning, the communities have to organize. We have to, and it's not a one and done community organizing. It's great that the city is, trying to rebuild itself. That developers are here, money is flowing here. But if the community doesn't stand up and say what it is that we want, that it's not a blank slate, right? It's not a blank slate. There are people who live here and we have thoughts and ideas of what we want in our community, and unless we voice them, you're going to live with whatever somebody else wants to put in your community. And we not only community organizing for things that, are official, like a community benefits agreement. When developers come in, there's nothing that says you can't negotiate with that developer. Every developer, if he wants money from the city, has to check a box that they did community engagement. Don't make it be just a box and that you just showed up at a meeting and they can check their box now. You have to get more engaged. And in our neighborhood, we are developing a tool to actually try to equip our residents. They did their neighborhood plan. They're now working on a scorecard. So when the developers come and say, come to a meeting, that they try to have one voice. You have a plan. All of you hold up the same plan, right? And now you have a tool that, well, we want, green space or whatever it is, and now you can score that development. And, our next step is to make sure that all city officials, particularly those that have anything to do with, economic development, are aware of this tool. And so a developer that comes to you and says they talk to our community and they don't show you this tool, they didn't really talk to us. So this is just one example of community has to stay engaged. It can't be a one and done for community benefits agreements, unofficial community benefits agreements, I'll call them, as well as community land trust and any other community ownership type models. It boils down to keeping community engaged.
And can you just repeat the second part of that question? We'll just get through it quickly so we can move on to the rest of them, but wanted to give you a chance.
What, the Dan Gilbert part?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, I almost said something bad. I'm sorry. The Shepherd on the east side, the Packer plant development that they're talking about right now. A lot of things that have already been talked about as they're going to happen, that they've been accepted, that they have Mayor Sheffield and Mike Duggan showing up to endorse it. But to Janine's point, there has been minimal, if any, real engagement with the community that lives there. More engagement with the businesses, more engagement with, nonprofits that might be over there, but Hawaii Pottery doesn't put food on the table. So how do we meet this challenge where they are right now instead of trying to talk to them from the first step? I think a lot of times we get stuck in trying to have the conversation from where we are, but we have to have the conversation where they are right now so we can actually shift what they're planning to do instead of attempting to undo what they've already done.
Well, every neighborhood has, if nothing else, start with your Department of Neighborhoods. If nothing else, start with your Department of Neighborhoods director and deputy director. Their job is to bring the city to you. And they should be able to connect you with HRD, who knows, no development can get past planning and or HRD. And so they know, right? So make your district manager work for you. Make sure that district manager is keeping you informed of what's coming to the neighborhood so that you can organize your own community meetings, and ask for those developers to come to your meetings and share what plans they have and are they willing to, take feedback and so on and so forth. I think you can make it work.
And I would say that, I don't know if this is on or not, but the situation is the most difficult when neighborhoods, oh yeah, that's right, that makes a difference. I think it's hardest when residents are put in a position of reaction, right? And that's true of any conflict, right? And the neighborhoods or communities that seem to do the most, that have the strongest position in these situations, whether it's gentrification or one big project, are typically the ones that aren't just saying no and that don't fall into the politically discrediting trap of being labeled NIMBY, but rather have a vision going forward into it. And I think that's one of the reasons why the CLT is a good example, but not the only, of it's a proactive thing that's being done. And the prime mover is the community, and they're laying down the terms. But if it's very difficult, easy to say standing here, but much more difficult to do in practice. But if one is in a position of just waiting for the developer to be the agent and then reacting, that's much more difficult. And so that's why I think Detroit has an amazing history of organizing to build on, right, in that direction. But I think that's the only answer I can give to that. But I think it's important because that can also shift the narrative around development. It's not just about the meetings, about the way people talk about it on social media and things like that. You mentioned Gilbert, and his business model was always about the narrative of him as the developer. There's actually plenty of large landowners in Detroit that own a lot of property that have a different business model. His was that particular one about a narrative about him as an agent or a mover and the community. And I think communities, I'm not saying they play that game too exactly, but think of themselves as agents and movers and not just reacting. And I'm not saying people aren't already doing it, but you want to avoid the politically discrediting trap of just being no, right? And having a vision and an agenda. And examples I've studied, like in my own dissertation, on a very different city. It was on outskirts of Paris, but it was about a community group that fought off successfully a huge battle to have a trucking depot put in their neighborhood, which would have increased asthma rates and caused a huge amount of problems. And they were able to, they succeeded not by saying no, but by saying we need a park here instead. And by looking at a benefit, one could say. In this case, they actually shifted the entire development, but it's a very different political situation, very different landscape. But the general principle of being proactive and having a vision, I think, is really key for this kind of stuff. So.
I want to build on this kind of notion that we're left to developers, and coming out of the last conversation that was held here was around urban agriculture. Kind of built out of that urban agriculture movement was this idea of self-provisioning, self-sufficiency, because grocery stores were removed, then food apartheid was implemented in the city. I think that my whole stance and my practice is to kind of bring that to the development world, and that is through small-scale developments, bringing everybody to pick up a hammer and a drill and do it themselves and learn it themselves and build the skills together. And that's kind of where that slow pace comes, because you're skill building, you're knowledge building, and you're wealth building at the same time. When we imagine new forms of housing, that Janine brought up, the cost of housing, materials, has gone up, but the technology hasn't changed. We've been building houses the same way for centuries. And I don't think new technology is going to really change affordability. But I think what is who we get to come in and help build it. We've got a lot of kids in these neighborhoods who don't have access to woodshop, who don't have access to home economics, and who can come in and learn, because there's a lot of construction crews in the cities that are renovating, a lot of these factories, into spaces of, kind of fabrication and things like that. Get them involved, build them the skills and the career paths to do that, right? What we're imagining now is we've got a culture of kind of self-governance because we are starting to develop a means of owning the means of production. And I think this challenges, and this is a long-term game, right? Development moves faster when you got lots of money and when you get lots of tax incentives for your big developments, right? And so I think to challenge that methodology, especially on the east side, where we see, and don't forget the Lantern building, right? That big, where OMA came in, one of the world's largest architecture firms came in and designed this, this cute little building. And I think that section is really unique, and it is very fast-moving with lots of money. And I'm wondering how, when these times are very urgent, can we slow down and really align our heads, our hearts, and our hands to really take the self-governance in our neighborhood and to do it? Because I know a lot of people got tools in their basement, lots of people got tools in their garage. Turn those into production spaces repair the front porches of your houses and start to build those skills and start to think about how we can build homes ourselves. It's slower, right? And it's challenging because things are really urgent. Yep.
Yeah, you've talked about the CLT model as being useful for developing contiguous vacant lands for things like new housing or urban farms. I'm wondering if the CLT model would work in a neighborhood where you have scattered land bank owned houses that are oftentimes derelict. And could the CLT model be used to take those houses, even though they're not contiguous to each other?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes, it can be used for scattered site development for sure. It can be used to acquire houses. It doesn't have to just be land, right? Then the CLT owns not only the land, but what's on top of it. So the possibilities of how you can use the tool is really endless. It's what do you need in your community? And that's the good that you would do with the land. There's even been instances, and I keep pointing to Minneapolis, I think it's just, I'm like, wow, wish we had their environment here. But Rondo CLT have actually saved people from losing their homes by acquiring that home, putting it in the CLT, and then putting that family back into that home. So there's a lot of ways that you can use the CLT, and scattered site is for sure one of them.
All right, we're going to move on to some virtual questions. I think Aaron, you might be the best person to answer this one, and then we'll move on to the next one. Lisa wants to know how flexible community benefit agreements are, and if we talked about this a little bit. It kind of depends on what the needs that are identified by residents in those particular areas. But she wants to know if there are some standard key position provisions in that, or what is kind of the universe of what we can include in a community benefits agreement.
Sure. No, thank you for the question. And so I'll say, it kind of starts as an open negotiation where, the community and planning to some extent will identify some kind of key topics to focus on. I will say that, having done 16 of these now, I've been around for about 6 of them, I think we start to learn some best practices and things start, when we tell neighborhood advisory councils, like, look at what's been done before, it doesn't have to tell you what you do now, but it can be a helpful guide. So I think, some things like as simple as like the developer's going to have a website with construction information and a portal for how people can get jobs. That's become a pretty standard thing. It's not something that's required by law, but we put into the agreement. But I think there is a lot of flexibility. I think another example I would say is, and this kind of gets into like how what happens in CBA can start to affect kind of long-term practice and policy, is around affordable housing. And some of the projects that include housing, they already have to follow our affordable housing ordinance, which would require a certain 20% of units to be able to be rented at the 80% level of the area median income, which is a very wonky technical term that we don't have to get into right now. But I think important thing to note is, the area median income is a regional number, not Detroit specific. And so that what you find is that 80% often doesn't really speak to average Detroiters, quite honestly. So, one of the interesting, but then you get into housing financing, how do you make the numbers come together, all that. So, there's a little bit of a struggle there about how do you get deeper affordability into these projects. Early on CBA projects, neighbors really pushed on that, and they were able to get the developer to agree to maybe doing a smaller amount of units at a deeper level of affordability. And now we've kind of come to this interesting place where a lot of projects, it's almost expected that yes, 80% is the law, but these projects already kind of come to the table with a 60% AMI section of their project or a 50% AMI project, because they know that's kind of like the expectation of the community, and in some cases, the city, elected officials, all that as well. So I might have gone a little further afield, but I would say there is a lot of flexibility, what can be in a CBA, because it is a contract between the city and the developer, and contracts can include whatever the two parties agree to.
Thank you. I think that the CBAs promote inequality and division within the city, the way they are implemented. For instance, city officials say that the impact area is being negatively impacted, when in actuality it's being positively impacted by receiving new, beautiful development in an area that's really dilapidated. So they are in turn getting increased home values. When the district Detroit did its CBA, they gave Cass Tech $1 million, which Cass Tech probably gets the majority of the dollars from the city, the district. Other schools are suffering because they don't have funds. So how can we be one Detroit when these CBAs promote this kind of inequality in the city and division?
Well, thank you for the perspective, and I appreciate what you're getting at, because I agree that there is a tension that exists when you have a development in an area, and the ordinance really specifies, like, we are to draw an impact area, has to at least be the census tract. And there is an assumption that there will be impacts. Some of them are positive, some of them may be negative, and the whole idea around the community benefits ordinance is to make sure that we're addressing any potential negative impacts of the project. And I agree with the statement that development also brings positive impacts to an area, and it brings positive impacts to the city. But the framework that is designed around is to focus in on that impact area, how it is drawn, which is a limited geographic area, whereas quite admittedly, there's the argument that's made, as you definitely made, that these projects actually mean something to a larger geographic area. So I don't really have a great answer necessarily. It kind of is the design of the ordinance and what it's emphasis on. I'm not a policymaker. My job is to implement the ordinance as it is, but I appreciate the thought, though, and the issues you raise. I don't know if someone else has something they want to add on that.
I mean, only to really minimally underline, I think that's actually a really interesting and valid point, which, as you mentioned, is a product of the fact that the district is imagined as a zone, and therefore, like in a different situation, would a developer, if they negotiated with the city council, provide a benefit that the whole city could theoretically benefit from? So I only simply actually affirming that, yeah, I think it's a problem that seems inherent to the model. Although in theory, like you said, if an agreement is made in a certain way, it doesn't have to be that way. But yeah.
Yeah, because the impact is on the entire city, because the loss of revenue affects the entire city, not just Town.
Aaron, can you talk about how the planning department defines the impact area, maybe? Because that's sometimes come up as...
Yeah, I definitely can talk about that. I will just add one more thing before I get into that, is there have been instances where at least the benefits that negotiate are not just limited to the impact area. There is a larger kind of scope to that, but it's not all the time, though, and it's kind of very specific kind of instances. As far as the impact area is concerned, it's a very good point about what the ordinance kind of says about the impact area. So it has to be at least the census tract that the project is actually located in. And then the planning department, by its discretion, can add additional census tracts as appropriate. Sometimes census tracts are arbitrary lines, just like everything else. And if a project is sitting on Woodward, and Woodward is a dividing line of a census tract, we're not just going to say, well, since this project is west of Woodward, this census tract west of Woodward, you could be the impact area, but you folks that live in the Ellington over there, that are across the street, no. So we definitely take a context-specific approach to it. Try to make sure that impact area is kind of respecting neighborhood boundaries, and has a sufficient number of people, because I think we've also learned that if you draw your impact area too small, the number of people who maybe want to volunteer to fill out a 9-person neighborhood advisory council, you might fall short, because it's a lot of work. But so we kind of learned some things, that we need to have at least a certain number of people in an impact area, and depending on the scale of the project, the impact area can be quite large. I'll just take Stellantis as an example. As a huge project, hundreds of acres, and the impact area, I think, had like 10,000 people living in it. It was a very kind of large area, and I think that was important for that project. Other projects, like a hotel downtown, maybe, you know, it makes sense to be a little more limited in on that.
All right, this is going to be our final question. Angela wants to know, and this is kind of in the context of reforms to the ordinance and talking about the trigger level of, you know, what investment requires the CBO. She wants to know what efforts are being made to implement a community benefits process when the total project development or the total project will exceed the threshold and trigger the ordinance, but it's broken up into phased segments that no longer meet the criteria. And I think she's probably referencing the WMBA site, which is not, from my understanding, triggering a CBO.
Yep.
So yeah, I don't know if there's, Aaron, maybe you would like to address that, and then we can work through.
So I would say, you know, develop is interesting, and it doesn't always happen at once, and sometimes projects come to us, projects come to us and they tell us what they're doing, and then we have to evaluate based on what they tell us it is, and our understanding of it. And I think there's been many projects that have gone through the CBO process that by themselves, it's like a multi-phase development plan that by themselves, individual projects within that would not have necessarily triggered, but you know, there's been a choice made by the developer or by other decision makers that, you know, this project makes sense together. It's one plan. You know, I'll just take District Detroit. You know, there's 10 proposed buildings in District Detroit, and some of them weren't $75 million projects. They could have tried to extract those out. They didn't do that. Or I'll take the future of health as an example as well. Quite honestly, the hospital itself didn't have to be part of the CBA process, but I think Henry Ford decided that it made sense because you know, because of the housing, because of the medical research. So there are examples in both kind of ways where we see projects, you know, that do get, you know, put together to go through a process when maybe, you know, individual parts of it didn't have to. I don't know all the details on the WNBA one in particular. I do know that the project that was proposed that received the tax breaks, though, was under the tier 1 threshold. I know there's another part proposed for that, but I think it's actually being technically developed by a different legal entity via a nonprofit. So I think that kind of changes some of the discussion around it. And that's my understanding of it. I will say also, you know, there was another example in Corktown and then I'll give it to you, Janine, where there was actually, because they had the Godfrey Hotel, people might remember that, and that was not a tier 1 project, but we knew that developer had plans for future development, and we actually, you know, Godfrey was a tier 2 project, and we actually wrote in, it's like, when you do this other project, is going to be a tier 1 process, you know, even if it's kind of like borderline. So that was another example where we're kind of looking ahead and we know, and we kind of made that, you know, it's like, you're going to have to go through this, you know, with your other project, because it's kind
So
of like
it really depends on what the developer has brought to the city in terms of like their overall investment and their vision for what counts as their development. That's kind of the consistent standard that's used?
Yes.
Okay.
But by allowing the WNBA to break their development into pieces, you're setting a precedent. So you're creating a loophole for the community benefits agreement. I really feel like they should be being held accountable and not be allowed to break it into, any time a developer develops, you establish some kind of a LLC to like protect your entity, right? So that's normal. But to allow a developer, knowing that he's going to develop this whole big old Unirural site, and allow them to get away from not having to fall up under the CBA, is setting a precedence and providing a loophole for future developers, and you really need to plug that hole now, so that you're you're going to make the tool ineffective in the future because others are going to say and do the same thing. Oh, well, I've got 2 buildings, I'll make it into 2 different things, and now I don't have to deal with the community. So I think you're weakening the tool if we let the WNBA do what it's doing.
All right, we're all going to have to chew on that for a little bit because that is our time for today. Another round of applause, please, for our great panel.